It all started past midnight, when a wind of fire rose from the Carolina pines. By sunrise, the plantation was gone, and 9 men lay dead in the ashes. But this wasn't an accident. It was a man's vengeance, born from years of pain, loss, and chains. His name? Elijah, a man who refused to kneel. Tonight, you'll hear the story that history tried to erase, and why one night of fire changed everything. Stick around, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Imagine waking up before the sun. Every morning the same, a bell ringing across the fields, pulling you from sleep into work that never ends. That was life on Magnolia Hill, a plantation in North Carolina in the 1840s, from a distance. It might have looked peaceful, the mist rising over tobacco and cotton fields, the morning light hitting the trees just right. But up close, it was a world carved by fear. Slaves moved through the mist quietly, their backs bent, hands calloused, voices low. Every day started before dawn and ended after the sun had long disappeared. Overseers like Mr. Harlan ruled with whips and shouts. The Mathers, the wealthy family who owned Magnolia Hill, treated humans like property, counting them alongside horses and barrels of tobacco dot. Yet even in that world, life fought to exist. At night, families gathered around small fires outside their cabins. They told stories, sang old songs from Africa, and held on to memories of a world they had been torn from. Laughter was rare, but it was precious. In this world lived Elijah. Tall, quiet, careful. A man who never complained, never raised his voice, never flinched under the lash. To the white men, he was invisible, but to those around him, he carried a quiet strength, an unspoken presence that people noticed. He worked the stables, tended to horses, mended harnesses. The animals seemed to trust him more than anyone else. Every day was a cycle of labor, hunger, exhaustion, and brief sleep. But beneath the rhythm, anger and sorrow simmered. Every lash, every stolen child, every broken body added fuel to a fire no one dared speak about. And though no one knew it yet, that quiet fire in Elijah's heart would one day burn brighter than anyone could imagine. Elijah had spent his entire life on Magnolia Hill. He was born into chains, and a plantation was all he'd ever known. His mother, Rachel, was strong and full of voice, singing old African songs as she worked the fields. Elijah remembered her humming, a sound that carried across the rows of tobacco, a song of hope even in a world that offered none. But he was only 8 when she was sold, taken from him forever. That first loss never truly healed Dot as he grew. Elijah became tall, strong, and careful. The overseers noticed his strength and moved him to the stables, where he worked with the horses, mended saddles, and cleaned stalls. He spoke little, and when he did, it was always calm. People said he could see right into a man's heart, and that silence gave him a presence no whip could break. At 24, he met Ruth, a quick-witted young woman from a neighboring plantation. They married quietly under the stars, sharing whispered dreams of freedom, of children, of a life they could only imagine. When their son Jacob was born, Elijah felt a spark of joy he had never known. The child's laughter filled the quarters, and for a brief time, life felt bearable, even beautiful. But hope can be dangerous. One afternoon, a trader arrived. Debt had forced the Mathers to sell, and Jacob was taken. Elijah returned to find Ruth on the cabin floor, screaming for her child. That night, he didn't speak. He simply held her, staring at the door through which their son had disappeared. After that, Elijah changed. His calm became sharper, his movements slower, deliberate. He endured the lash, the insults, the cruelty, but inside, a storm was growing. People began to notice the difference in him, a quiet strength that seemed to hum beneath the surface. He no longer grieved openly. Instead, he carried his sorrow silently, letting it harden into a quiet, unshakable resolve. Every day he worked, every night he watched, and every night he remembered. And in that silence, a thought began to take shape, a thought of fire, of justice, of a world that would finally feel the weight of what had been done to him and his family. Elijah was no longer just a man enduring life. He was a man preparing to change it forever. By the summer of 1847, the Carolina heat was suffocating. The days on Magnolia Hill dragged on endlessly, the overseer's whip cracking like thunder across the fields. Life had always been cruel, but that summer felt different, heavier, more unbearable. One morning, it all came to a head. Ruth was near the well, clutching a small tin cup, when Mr. Harlan, the overseer, accused her of stealing a biscuit. Just one. She tried to explain, but he didn't care. He struck her across the face. The sound echoed through the yard like a gunshot. Elijah froze at first, gripping a saddle strap. Then he stepped forward. "Please, sir," he said, his voice low but steady. "She ain't done wrong." Harlan sneered. "You keep your mouth shut, boy," he spat. But Elijah didn't back down. "Go on," he repeated. "She didn't steal nothing." The overseer raised his whip. Each strike landed with terrifying precision. Ruth screamed once, then fell silent. Her body sagged under the blows. Elijah didn't move. He simply watched, every lash imprinting itself on his mind. When it was over, Harlan swaggered away, satisfied. Elijah knelt beside Ruth, his hands trembling as he untied her. Her eyes opened briefly, glassy with pain, but she couldn't speak. She was gone in the moments that followed. That night, Elijah buried her himself, behind their cabin, under a young oak tree. He sat there until the moon had climbed high, staring at the small pile of stones marking her grave. Something inside him had shifted. The quiet, patient man he had been was gone. In its place was a storm, slow, steady, and unstoppable. For days, he moved through the plantation as usual, silent, watching, learning. He memorized the patterns, the way the overseer walked, how the doors creaked, where dry hay and oil were stored. Every detail, every habit, every weakness. At night, he worked quietly in his cabin. He collected scraps of cloth, soaked them in oil, hid them under floorboards. He saved matches, one here, one there, tucking them into secret corners. Each act seemed small, almost meaningless, but in his mind, a plan was forming, and in that plan was fire. Not just fire to destroy, but fire to punish, fire to make the world remember. Fire that would answer for every lash, every stolen child, every heartbreak he had endured. Elijah was done surviving. He was ready. And when the night came, the world would see the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. After Ruth's death, Elijah felt something inside him change. Days and nights blurred together, the world moving on around him as if nothing had happened. But for Elijah, nothing would ever be the same. He walked the fields silently, worked the stables, tended the animals, but his mind was elsewhere, quiet, calculating. It started with small things. A spark from a lantern, a flicker of oil-soaked rags, fire. It was simple, yet powerful. Fire answered to no one. Fire destroyed what humans thought they controlled. And for the first time in his life, Elijah realized he could control something too. He began to watch, the way the wind passed through the barns, how the overseer slept after his nightly drink, the weak points in doors and fences. Every detail mattered. Every step could make the difference. He memorized the layout of the plantation, the big house, the barns, the storehouse, the rows of cabins. Every corner, every path, every hidden space. By day, He acted like the obedient servant, quiet and unremarkable. By night, he moved like a shadow. He gathered oil-soaked cloth, stored matches in hidden tins, and practiced moving through the dark without making a sound. The other slaves thought he was grieving, and in a way, he was. But beneath that sorrow, a plan was forming. Even when the older men tried to counsel him, Elijah stayed distant. "Lord sees all, Elijah," said Samson one night. Elijah's eyes didn't leave the fire flickering in the lamp. "The Lord ain't the one with the whip," he said softly. The beat of the crickets, the hum of the night insects, became like a drum, counting down to something inevitable. Every day, every night, Elijah's resolve grew stronger. Every cruel act he witnessed, every story of pain he remembered, added fuel to the fire he carried inside. He visited Ruth's grave under the moonlight, whispering, "I'll see you soon." But not before they do. By mid-September, the preparations were complete. The barns were stacked with dry straw and feed, the storehouse filled with oil and wood. The land was a tinderbox, ready to ignite. One spark, one small action, and the plantation would burn. Elijah waited Dot each morning. He watched the sun rise, telling himself, not yet. Each night, the darkness wrapped around him, reminding him, almost Dot, and finally, when the night came thick and moonless, he knew it was time. The night arrived like a thick, suffocating blanket. No moon, no stars, just darkness pressing down on Magnolia Hill. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the fields, the low hum of crickets, and the occasional creak of a barn door. Elijah sat in his cabin, silent, holding a small tin of matches and a bundle of oil-soaked rags. His heart beat steadily, slow but fierce. As he took a deep breath and stepped into the night, he moved like a shadow, careful not to make a sound. The dogs didn't bark. They seemed to sense that something had changed. He went first to the barn, slipping inside quietly. The smell of hay, of horses, of sweat and grain filled his nose. He placed the first rags in corners, tucked them under hay, near the feed barrels, and struck a match. The small flame licked at the cloth before catching the hay. A faint hiss, then a roar. Elijah didn't look back. He walked out into the dark as the fire began to eat the barn alive. Next, the storehouse. Oil barrels, wood, and tools, everything ready to feed the blaze. He worked quickly, striking matches in careful corners, lighting the fire and moving on. The flames spread faster than he imagined, hungrily, consuming everything in their path. Finally, the big house. The grand white mansion sat silent atop its hill, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Inside, the Mathers and the overseer slept. Elijah slipped through the back steps. He knew every creaking board, every loose hinge. The dining room was quiet, the silver glinting faintly in the darkness. Elijah paused in front of a mirror, seeing a face he barely recognized. Hollow eyes, tight jaw, calm. He struck the match, set the curtain ablaze, and stepped outside. Behind him, the night became a living thing. Smoke curled into the sky. Flames devoured the walls, the roof, the pride of a family built on cruelty. The big house ignited with a roar. Windows shattered. A porch collapsed. The heat rolled outward like a wave, forcing the few awake to flee. The sounds of the plantation, shouting, crashing timbers, horses screaming, filled the night. Elijah stood at the edge of the yard, silent. His face was blank, but his heart was heavy with years of pain, loss, and grief finally released. The fire reached the sky, bright and furious. The master and his sons, the overseer, all caught in the inferno. 9 men who had ruled by cruelty were gone. The flames carried their screams into the night, and then, slowly, silenced. Elijah turned and walked toward the woods beyond the fields. He didn't run. He didn't celebrate. He walked steadily, calmly, into the dark. Behind him, Magnolia Hill burned to the ground. No one ever saw him again. Some say he disappeared into the forest and never returned. Others whisper that he became a ghost, haunting the memory of the cruel and the unjust. But one thing was clear. The man who had endured so much had finally struck back. And the world, at least that night, remembered his fire. When dawn finally broke over Magnolia Hill, it revealed a world turned to ash. The grand mansion, the barns, the storehouse, all gone. Smoke still curled into the sky, carrying the smell of fire and charred wood. The land was silent, almost holding its breath. Only the distant crow of a rooster and the occasional wind through the fields broke the heavy quiet. The enslaved people gathered at the edge of the yard, watching in stunned silence. They held their children close, their faces streaked with soot and tears. For years they had dreamed of freedom, but now it had arrived in a way none of them had imagined. Terrifying. Unstoppable, absolute. The white men arrived later, stumbling through the ruins, disbelief on their faces. The sheriff and a few neighbors combed through the wreckage, finding bodies where the fire had been fiercest. The master, his sons, and the overseer, all dead. The violence of that night was undeniable. Word of the fire spread like wildfire through the surrounding counties. Whispers turned into outrage, fear, and awe. The devil walks among us, some said. Others called it the work of a spirit. Patrols were sent out immediately, searching the forests and swamps, looking for Elijah. They tore through the cabins, demanded confessions, and threatened everyone who might know anything. But he was gone. His cabin was empty, save for a tin of matches on the table. No one saw him leave. No one saw him vanish. For the white families who survived, fear settled like a shadow. They locked doors, slept with guns beside their beds, and whispered warnings to one another about a man who could strike so completely. For the enslaved, grief mingled with pride. They mourned Ruth, Jacob, and the others who had suffered alongside them, but they also whispered Elijah's name with reverence. He had done what no one else dared. He had turned the power of the oppressor into flames. Weeks passed. The ashes of Magnolia Hill were washed by rain, but the land never fully recovered. New owners tried to rebuild, but the plantation seemed cursed, heavy with memory. Some said at dusk they could see a shadow moving across the fields, a man who walked freely in the night, carrying fire in his hands. Even as the years passed, the story of that night refused to die. It became a legend whispered across cabins, through songs and prayers, a tale of courage and vengeance. A tale that reminded people that chains could be broken, even if it came at the cost of fire. Elijah had vanished, but the mark he left behind was permanent. In the ashes of Magnolia Hill, a message burned louder than words ever could. Cruelty could be fought. Pain could be answered. And one man, armed with nothing but courage and fire, could shake the world. The fire at Magnolia Hill didn't end when the last ember died. It lived on, not in smoke or ash, but in whispers and stories carried quietly from one plantation to the next. No one knew exactly how the story spread. Maybe it was a field hand sold downriver, or a preacher who had stopped at Magnolia Hill months before. By the time the next harvest arrived, every plantation in the county had heard of the man who burned his masters alive. To the white families, Elijah was a shadow, a nightmare they could not forget. But to the enslaved, he became a symbol of something impossible: courage, resistance, freedom. Stories changed slightly with every telling. Some said he had walked into the forest and vanished, becoming a ghost. Others claimed lightning had joined him in his vengeance, striking the plantation in divine fury. A few whispered he was no longer a man at all, but a spirit who roamed from farm to farm, punishing cruelty wherever it lived. Whatever the version, the meaning stayed the same. One man, once a slave, had struck back, and the world had remembered Dot in secret. Enslaved people sang of him in the fields, and by firelight in the quarters. Old men tapped their knees softly, humming songs that carried the story of fire and defiance. Mothers whispered his name to their children, teaching them that courage can simmer quietly for years before it bursts forth like lightning. But fear lingered. The white families doubled patrols, tightened curfews, and punished the smallest hint of disobedience. Yet still, the story refused to die. Traveling preachers wove the tale into sermons, speaking of the burning bush and God's wrath against oppression. They never mentioned Elijah by name, but everyone listening knew exactly who they meant. Across the South, the legend grew. In Mississippi, he was the Burning Man. In Louisiana, the Fire Prophet. In South Carolina, simply the Ghost of Magnolia. Each name reflected the same truth. One man's courage had become larger than any person. Even decades later, after slavery had ended, the story lived on. Grandparents told it to grandchildren, reminding them that freedom could come in unexpected ways, that courage, patience, and defiance could light a fire that no chains could contain. Elijah's story became more than history. It became hope, a spark, a lesson that no matter how dark the night, one act of bravery could echo through generations. And so, even though he vanished from the world of men, Elijah's spirit walked on. In whispers, in stories, in the memory of fire, he was never gone. Long after the fires of Magnolia Hill had died, the story of that night refused to fade. Elijah had disappeared into the forests and rivers of North Carolina, and no one knew where he went. Some said he died in the woods. Others whispered that he escaped north, living as a free man among free black communities. But it didn't matter where he was. His legend had already grown larger than any man could contain. History tried to forget him. Newspapers called it an accident. Records listed the dead, but never the man who had lit the flames. The enslaved were recorded only as witnesses, never as people who had acted with purpose. But stories like Elijah's do not disappear. Around cabins and hidden churches. By firelight and under the stars, people passed down his story. Children learned of the man who refused to kneel, who turned pain into fire and oppression into a lesson. To them, Elijah was more than a man. He was courage itself. And for the white families who survived, fear lingered for decades. The memory of a single man overturning their power haunted dreams and whispered warnings to their rooms. Children, cruelty can be met with defiance, and no chains are unbreakable. Elijah's act was violent, yes, but it was human. It sprang from grief, loss, and suffering no law could justify. The fire he set was more than destruction. It was a declaration that the spirit cannot be owned. This is the reason his story resonates across time. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings or presidents, it is also shaped by those who endure in silence, who strike back when injustice has gone too far, and who refuse to bow even when the world says they must dot in the ashes of Magnolia Hill. One man's rage became a lesson for generations. One night of fire illuminated centuries of darkness. Today, few know his name. But the story survives, whispered from parent to child, told in hushed tones where courage and hope meet. Elijah walks still, not in flesh, but in memory. In every tale of resistance, in every act of defiance. He lives. When we walk across the old fields of North Carolina, when the wind rustles through the pines or the river whispers by, we can imagine him there, a shadow in the night, carrying fire in his hands and hope in his heart. Elijah vanished from the world of men, but he never vanished from the world of memory. And in the hearts of those who remember, he is forever free.